Today, I'm going to show you 4 traps you need to know in the Queen's Gambit. 2 are for white and 2 are for black. It starts with d4, d5, and you play c4. What defines the Queen's Gambit is this pawn sacrifice, c4 here, right? Your opponent captures with d, takes c4. However, the Queen's Gambit is actually a false gambit. You're not really sacrificing this pawn because in those lines you'll recover it later. And here, we'll take a look at what happens when black gets too greedy and tries to hold on to the extra pawn they gained in the opening. So, you play e3 with the clear idea of attacking the pawn on c4 with the bishop. If black makes the mistake of playing b5, a move that tries to hold on to the pawn advantage, you could immediately attack this pawn chain with a4. If your opponent captures on a4, you first give a check right after, and once they block the check, the opponent c4 falls, leaving you much better off early in the game. So, your opponent will usually play a move like a6 instead of taking that pawn. By attempting to build a strong pawn chain, you simply capture the pawn on b5, and your opponent cannot recapture. If they try to, which only happens against very inexperienced players, they lose the rook on a8. Normally, the opponent accepts the loss of the pawn, and shortly afterward, you recover the pawn on c4, gaining an advantage. Against more experienced opponents, they might play c6 with the same idea as a6, trying to solidify the pawn chain. When you capture, black recaptures and believe they are ahead because, in addition to the extra pawn, it's no longer doubled. However, you'll demonstrate that nothing comes for free. The sacrificed pawn will come at a high cost. With queen to f3, you threaten the rook on a8 and exploit the weaknesses on black's light squares. There's no way to avoid losing material. Black might try to defend with knight to c6. After you capture the knight, they block with the bishop, connecting the rook and queen. While they save the rook, they lose a knight, leaving you with an extra piece. You can tuck the queen away on a6 or bring it back to f3, maintaining your advantage. All of this demonstrates why the Queen's Gambit is considered a false gambit. Now, let's look at a position where your opponent understands this. You play e3 to recapture the pawn, but your opponent, knowing that the best option is to allow the recapture, plays knight to f6, a common move. You capture the pawn, and we reach the fianchetto variation, which is less frequent. It occurs in about 1 out of every 5 or 6 games in the Queen's Gambit accepted. Black's plan is simple. Fianchetto the dark-squared bishop, castle kingside, and establish a solid structure. You develop your knight to f3, preparing to castle. When black fianchettos the bishop, you spring the trap, queen to a4. Statistically, while other moves maintain equality, queen to a4 gives white a 60% win rate. This move gives check and puts the opponent's king in check. There's 1 correct way and 3 poor ways to block the check. If your opponent chooses incorrectly, you win. The correct move is the simplest, placing a pawn in the way, and the game continues, for example, with queen to b3, putting pressure on f7. Your opponent castles, you castle, and the game goes on. But let's analyze why this is a trap. The move that seems the most logical is blocking the check with the bishop. It comes with the idea of activity. You block the check with the piece that was undeveloped and is now active, while also gaining a tempo on your opponent's queen. However, here you play queen to b3, which threatens both the f7 pawn and the b7 pawn. It's impossible to defend both. It's one or the other. Either the b7 pawn falls, possibly followed by the rook, or the f7 pawn falls, taking away your opponent's ability to castle. If your opponent blocks with the queen, you have the brilliant bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes f7. Here, your opponent cannot recapture the bishop because as soon as they do, you play knight to e5, delivering a double attack on the king and the queen. Now, let's look at the last incorrect way to defend the check, which is knight to d7. This loses because you have the same bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes f7. After your opponent captures, you give the knight check with knight to g5. Every way to hide the king loses the game. If king to e8, you trap the queen. If king to f8, you deliver a double attack between the king and the queen. The move that seems the best because it doesn't lose the queen, king to g8, is actually the worst because it loses the game. After queen to c4, you have an unstoppable checkmate sequence. Your opponent can try placing a pawn in the way, but you'll capture it, and there's nothing they can do. It's checkmate on f7. Now, we'll look at two more traps, but this time from black's perspective. These traps come from the Queen's Gambit declined, which begins with e6. The idea behind this move is simple. You don't want to enter the accepted lines of a Queen's Gambit, so you defend your pawn with another pawn. White plays knight to c3, putting pressure on the pawn at d5. You defend the pawn while developing a piece with knight to f6. The move bishop to g5 puts indirect pressure on the pawn because your knight is now pinned. The recommended response is knight from b to d7. The correct continuation for your opponent would be to keep developing with e3 and knight to f3. However, if they get a little greedy, they might notice that the pawn appears to be hanging. The sequence is as follows. If the c pawn takes on d5 and you recapture with your e pawn, your opponent might capture that pawn with their knight, and you can't recapture without losing your queen. At this point, your opponent believes they've been clever and won a pawn. However, you'll respond by capturing the knight and sacrificing your queen. This happens because after bishop takes d8, capturing your queen, you play bishop to b4. Your opponent is forced to block with their queen. You then recapture the material, and after your opponent captures your bishop, you capture theirs. In the end, you're up a piece, that knight your opponent sacrificed in the center, thinking your knight was pinned. This is the third trap. The fourth comes from the same variation and happens when your opponent plays correctly with the pawn to e3. Now, that entire sequence no longer works, because after bishop to b4 check, your opponent simply moves the king out of the way. So, you need to defend the pawn with c6, and they continue developing their pieces. In this position, the recommended move is queen to a5, which has a clear attacking idea. The knight is pinned, and if your opponent wastes a move, bishop to b4 will soon follow, along with knight to e4. With this, you'll win at least a pawn, possibly a piece, or even a rook with check. This attack cannot be ignored. After queen to a5, it's common for your opponent to try to control the e4 square to prevent the knight from jumping. Therefore, the move bishop to d3 is common. Even so, you can play knight to e4. The threat is clear. To capture their knight, and when the pawn recaptures, you take the pawn with check. However, your opponent placed the bishop on d3 precisely to stop this situation. If the bishop takes the knight immediately, you recapture with the pawn and start threatening both your opponent's knight and bishop. This position is tricky for white, although they are not immediately lost. They can play knight to e5, which holds the position for now. However, most of your opponents won't want to deal with this, so another common move is queen to c2, aiming to capture twice and win the pawn. This falls into the trap because you have knight takes bishop on g5. After your opponent recaptures the bishop with the knight, you take the pawn on c4, threatening both your opponent's knight and bishop, and only one can be saved. Well, folks, these are the 4 traps every player who plays with or against the Queen's Gambit should know. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to keep improving your chess skills and like the way I explain things, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps me bring more content like this. I invite you to join me again in the next video. Take care and see you next time.